Do we have too much government?
We need to put people ahead of corporate profits.
This system is so lopsided. This threat is a real threat to democracy.
And I think that's really important. That's something we haven't been doing in this country for a long time.
Where do you start? What do you do? How do you do it?
Access to Democracy and other Eagan community television programming is supported by Thomson Reuters, makers of Westlaw Next and based in Eagan. Through Westlaw Next and other innovative online services, Thomson Reuters is the world's leading source of intelligent information for businesses and professionals. Online at thomsonreuters.com. And by U.S. Federal Credit Union, the member-owned financial institution offering service, value, and experience you can trust to the greater Twin Cities community.
And we're back with Access to Democracy. Interesting story as part of today's interview. When I was traveling west with stagecoaches back in about 1850 or 60, we came upon a huckster who was selling liquor. And he dropped off in the Wisconsin territory and established a distillery. And here we are 150 years later, and Paul Werni is still with us. Well, maybe that's a little bit of an exaggeration. But you first came on here 4 years ago. You were just getting established with 45th Parallel Vodka, which I fell in love with. And it is such a pleasure to see somebody who has taken a dream and turned it into a reality and met with the success that you have met with. So, Paul, welcome back.
Well, thank you for having us.
It's our pleasure. So, we started out with this very pure corn vodka. What's happened since then?
Well, as you said, the first 2 years was just the vodka, and then we started making gin, and we started making a horseradish vodka for a local establishment in the Twin Cities.
Horseradish vodka?
Yeah.
That sounds interesting.
Yeah. A couple Russians out of St. Paul came to my building, and they just said, hey, we make this horseradish vodka on our own. They're taking a vodka and infusing it with horseradish, and asked if I could make it commercially for them. And so we started doing that. We've been doing that since 2009. And at the same time, another gentleman came through the door, and I had met in Kentucky and asked us to start making whiskey. And so we started making bourbon at that time for them. And at the same time, we started barreling our own whiskey. And this past August...
Making bourbon is not something that you can just make it and sell it.
No.
Don't you have to store it in kegs and get these casks?
That's the hard part about it. The hard part is we started making bourbon in 2009, and in 2012, this past August, was the first time we opened a barrel and bottled it. So it took almost 3 years before we had something that we could sell. And now we've been selling it in western Wisconsin for the past 4 months, and we're moving into Minnesota now.
And the reaction to it, I understand, has been very positive.
Yeah, we've had good reactions to it, and Minneapolis St. Paul Magazine just ranked it best local bourbon.
And you've certainly won a lot of awards with the vodka.
Yes, we've been pretty fortunate. Even though our distillery is in western Wisconsin, I do live in Minnesota, and some of the local publications have been favorable to us. Minnesota Monthly ranked the best local vodka in 2011.
I rank it beyond that. I rank it as one of the best vodkas. There's a certain purity to that vodka that really is outstanding. And maybe you tell us the procedure you use to make it.
It starts with the materials. We get all our grain from a local farm within minutes of our building, and it's fairly unique to make a vodka in one place. So we do all the mashing, all the fermenting, and all the distilling and filtering in the one building. And that's not that common. And so it's a batch vodka. That means that each batch that we distill is one at a time. Whereas a large industrial facility would be continuous distillation, continuous. There's not batches.
And you're putting it through a lot of purity tests also.
Yeah, well, the water. Well, 60% of what goes into vodka is water. And so you have to be very careful about the water that you put in your vodka.
And it certainly has taken off beyond Wisconsin and Minnesota now.
It has. It hasn't. We started to push into other states, but since then we're a small facility, and it was hard for us to support it in other areas with resources, marketing. So if anything, with all the new brands that we've been coming out with lately, we don't have the resources to go out and support it in other states. So we're actually pulling back into doing more of a local marketing first, and putting our resources into the Minnesota, Wisconsin areas. Similar, there was just an article this past week with Summit Brewing, and that's what they've been doing for 25 years, just focusing on their local market, and they're very successful at it. And I think we're doing the same thing right now.
Now, what is Border Bourbon?
Border Bourbon is, it's made in our building. Two of the gentlemen that distill and are from Wisconsin, and two of them are from Minnesota. And so, especially on this weekend, it's border battle, the Vikings and the Packers. So we decided to call it Border Bourbon.
And tell us how you got into bourbon, and what the procedures are, and what about the equipment. We haven't even talked about your expansion yet, but
you use the same equipment. It's almost similar to making vodka in many aspects. There's a saying that everything starts out as vodka, and that's true to a point. When it comes to mashing and fermenting, anything that I mash and ferment, I can make it into either a vodka or a gin. It just depends on how you distill it, and my equipment allows me to do both. So we were already set up for corn, because our vodka is made out of 100% corn, and bourbon, one of the main requirements for a bourbon, it has to be more than 50% corn. So bourbon is really a corn-based whiskey. And in 2009, a company came to us and said, we understand that you're familiar with distilling with corn. Would you make us a bourbon? And that's how we got started making bourbon. And since then, we've been barreling and aging our own bourbon, and now we're selling it. There's as you were talking before, you said that, well, you were told that only bourbon from Kentucky can be called bourbon.
yeah, as I explained to you, really one of my best friends,
Yeah.
who happens to be a Kentucky colonel, was very resolute about this. It can't be bourbon unless it's made in Kentucky. And I said, no, it is bourbon. I know it's bourbon. They have bourbon on the label.
Yeah, there's some misinformation. There's a lot of misinformation in this industry. In the 60s, when Eisenhower was president, bourbon was declared the American spirit. And the number one criteria for bourbon is it has to be made in the U.S. That's it. Made in the U.S. and then have more than 50% corn. And that's how you make bourbon.
And this is made in the U.S.,
Yes.
and it's more than 50% corn.
Yes.
And we're a little ways past the Eisenhower era.
And you're finding bourbons in many other states now. So with the rise of the craft distilling industry, and because it is the American spirit, and in the Midwest there's a lot of corn, there are a lot of small distilleries starting to make bourbon outside of Kentucky.
Kentuckians cannot be happy about that.
Actually, they've been okay, especially the distillers. When we first came out with our bourbon, writer asked me if he could bring it down to the bourbon tour down in Kentucky, and he brought it to the distillers down there, and they were actually very positive and excited about it. Our bourbon is not just any bourbon, it's a straight bourbon. And a straight bourbon requires a minimum of 2 years aging, and that's unusual for small distilleries. And so what the distillers were telling him down there, they said, at least he's making a straight bourbon. We're happy that he's taking the time to age it properly. And so we got good feedback down there.
So all of that was, I guess, the cause of you having to double your facility, the size of your facility, which is an incredible success story in 4 years.
Well, barrels take up a lot of space. So right now we have 120 53-gallon barrels aging, and we are adding another. I just ordered another 24 barrels. So we added 75 barrels this year to our inventory, and next year we'll add another 100 barrels. So they take up a lot of space.
I just read an interesting article about barrels. Barrels are just not pieces of wood that are made into barrels. These meet very, very strict standards and specifications, and they're also very expensive.
Well, barrels, what you need is you need white oak. White oak provides a good seal. So there's white oak in the Ozark. That's a very common place to get white oak. In the Ozarks of Missouri, Kentucky. But then there's also the northern white oak. There are Coopers in Minnesota. There's several. There's 2 small Coopers that are fairly successful in Minnesota right now, and they're using northern white oak, tighter grain. I use the southern white oak. I want to be more of a traditional Kentucky-style bourbon. That's what we're looking for. And so we use. They're charred, but more importantly than the wood is how it's prepared. It's in the 50s, or right after World War II. Wood was kiln dried, but then the kiln drying left just basically a vessel. But what they didn't understand before is the air drying method that they used to use. The water from the rain will wash away the harsh tannins, and then fungus would be allowed to grow, develop in the wood and penetrate the wood, and it provided flavoring components. So now most quality barrels are actually air dried out in elements. Our stave is a piece of wood that's used to make a barrel. Our staves are air dried 3 years before they're made into a barrel.
And they're large. You said 53 gallons?
There's a variety of sizes. Most small distilleries use small barrels. That's what the Minnesota cooperage is. They specialize in small barrels. That's why we don't use Minnesota barrels, because we're more interested in the larger, standard size, traditional barrels, 53 gallons. That's what we use. But a lot of the small distilleries, a lot of the small bourbons are made in 5 or 7 or 10 or 15 gallon barrels.
I would think the bigger ones have a better chance in the white oak in 2 years to really age and ferment nicely.
Well, the reason why a small distillery uses a small barrel is because there's an impression that the smaller barrel will age faster. The marketing will say, well, one year in a small barrel is the same as 3 years in a standard sized barrel. And that is the truth in some aspects of aging, but not all aspects of aging. So even if you ask the cooper that makes a small barrel, to be honest with you, as far as how can we complete our aging process, and he said, it's time. It doesn't matter. You can't speed up the aging process. You can only speed up aspects of it. So that's one of the reasons why we stayed with the traditional large barrel. It's painful. It's cash flow is an issue because you don't see any revenue on your whiskey for a long time.
How expensive is a barrel?
Barrels aren't. The small barrels are actually more expensive than the big barrels. A big barrel is around $100. A good barrel is probably between $125 and $200 for the barrel, but then the shipping is almost that much. That's the expensive part.
And then, of course, as you said, once they get here, you have to have the place to store them. They're
Yes.
going to sit for at least 2 years.
Yes, minimum, if you want to call it a straight whiskey. There are companies out there that right now, like the one that we make bourbon for in bulk, they have a warehouse down in the Madison area that's full of hundreds of barrels waiting to be released.
Now, you got into other things also.
We make a liqueur. We make Madison Avenue liqueur. Our address is on Madison Avenue. And last year we started with a limoncello, and this year we added our orangecello. And we hope to add flavors every year. The one thing that's very interesting, that's very unique, is the dill aquavit. Dill aquavit is, there's maybe one
Which
of
is the one that's over here on the end of the table.
yeah. Aquavit
Maybe
is,
we can get a close-up on that. Dill aquavit.
yes. Aquavit,
Wrong direction, Jared. There we go. Right on.
That was not our idea. It came from another gentleman out of St. Paul who spent time in Denmark and wanted, in Denmark it was popular for dill aquavit. Dill was substituted for caraway. And nobody makes it. At least nobody makes it anymore. So we started
Alcohol
making it.
content?
80, it's actually a little higher, 84 proof.
84 proof.
Yes.
So you don't need too much of that to disconnect from society.
No, no, you don't. Aquavits tend to be a little bit higher proof. I think of aquavit as similar to gin. I say gin for Scandinavians. Instead of juniper berries, they use caraway or dill. And high-end gins tend to be higher proof, and same with aquavits.
Now, you did not bring us a gin, but you also have
Yes.
made a gin which has been acknowledged also as one of the best gins.
Yeah, and the reason why I didn't bring the gin is because we're changing the packaging on it, and plus we're adding another gin. So if I'm lucky enough to come back here again, I'll bring the gins.
You're always welcome to come back here. We love a success story, and yours is, I mean, you're a person who started out in construction.
Yes.
You took yourself a hiatus. You went to Europe to learn how to distill liquors.
Well, I went there and I toured, and I did see facilities, and I learned about the equipment. But I think most of the learning on distilling, I learned some of their methods, but most of it was learned here.
And was it a painful process? Were there mistakes along the way before you got to really the perfection that I've experienced in sampling some of these?
Yeah, I think it's just like any other business. There's pain in growth and in starting up and learning. We're not unique in that regard, but yeah, I guess if you're going to start a business, you better be prepared for some pain.
Now, equipment-wise, what do you use? How many different types of equipment do you have to use for each process? Or are they all done on one piece of equipment?
Well, we only have one pot still. Our equipment is linked together. So if we use part of it, we can make one thing, like the whiskey. If we add another piece, then we can make a vodka. Or another piece, we can make a gin. So we don't really have to buy a whole bunch of equipment to make different things. Mainly what we have to buy are tanks, storing tanks. Because the more products you have, the more tanks you need. And we only deal with stainless steel, and that takes up space too. That's the hard part. When we start filling up tanks, that's when we have a problem. That's our bottleneck in our production.
And that also caused you to renovate, right?
Yes.
So tell us about that.
Last winter, they broke ground, and actually probably around this time they had already poured the slab, and then they did the building in winter. And we basically doubled the size of our building, a little bit more than doubled the size of our building. So, but it's a modest building. It's a steel construction building. It's tall ceilings, and so we can go up pretty high. We have 27-foot ceilings, mainly because
You
of
can store those barrels.
storing the barrels up high, and then our column for making vodka needs a lot of height, and so that's why we have the tall ceilings.
Yeah, we have toured some distilleries in the islands and places like that.
Yes.
And the massive size of the facilities and the height is always overwhelming.
Yeah.
And we were out in Napa over the summer and went through some of the wineries also with the same situation.
Yeah, wherever I go, if I can find a production facility, I always try to stop it and see them. You said you're going down south.
Yeah, we're going back to Puerto Vallarta, right?
Yeah, when I was there last spring, I went to about 3 different tequila factories, as they call them, factories.
Now, there's an incredible operation also, tequila.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
The way it's made and processed until it comes to the table.
Yeah. There's a lot of small tequila factories in Mexico right now that they call them factories, but they're just a little little places, almost in a hut, and
It's like a family operation in
Exactly.
many cases.
Exactly.
Although yours started out as a family operation, I think you probably have more personnel now. I don't know how big the operation has gotten.
We're still small. There's only 4 of us, and but that's more than there were 3-4 years ago.
So, where do we go from here? What's on the horizon?
Well, we have a rye whiskey coming out anytime, and we have a wheat whiskey aging. So we're really going into the aged spirits. We plan on making rum and aging rum. And we're working on a higher-end gin, a gin that would be more for the gin connoisseur. And so those are the things we're working on. And then we'll probably settle down for a little bit on those.
Well, settling down with about 10 or 12 products.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, is it fair to say that one of the things that keeps you local in the area of the Northwest is the cost of advertising, the cost of public relations, the cost of really jumping to the big markets, to television?
Yes, there's a lot of competition. The big distilleries, they learned a lesson from from the big breweries. What happened with the small breweries coming in and taking a large part of the market. The big distilleries have been much more proactive and in dealing with the expansion of small distilling. But yeah, that's to be expected. It's a big industry. There's a lot of money in it.
What is Arlen Straight's Russmar Farm?
It's a 6th-generation family farm, and it's about 8 miles from our building. And the mills, the companies that take all the farmers' grain and mill it for feed, they had recommended this farm as having the highest quality and most consistent crops.
In terms of corn?
Corn, primary crop. That's the primary crop around here. But we also get wheat. We get rye from him and wheat from him. He doesn't necessarily always grow the wheat or the rye, but he usually gets it from a neighbor, or we source it through him. But he seems to be growing more and more what we need now, because we're consistently purchasing more grain from him.
And that also gives you the ability to keep really good control over the quality of what you're getting.
Exactly. We're not going to a large feed mill, and we're not getting it from 100 or 200 farmers. We're getting it from one farm, and that's it.
And you give, and I think we've talked about this, I think Mary, as a matter of fact, and her family toured your operation this summer.
Yes.
Tell us about the tours, how you got into that, and
Well,
what's involved.
we've always given tours. We've always had a little bit of an open facility because we're really in a small community, and not a lot of people knew about us. So we'd always welcome visitors so they could see what we were doing, because we didn't have the marketing dollars to put it on radio or in the paper. And then about 2 years ago, the laws changed and we could put in a tasting room. So now we have a tasting room with a small bar and a retail area. And so then we started, Groupon came out and said, would you like to do a special on tours to your facility? So we did that, and we were surprised with how successful it was and how many people. I know there's a lot of horror stories about how a Groupon can really hurt like maybe a restaurant. But for us, it's bringing people out there, and they just get to talk to us and learn about what we do. And then they usually purchase. So it's
And become customers.
Exactly. And it's been great. It's worked out very well for us. So every Friday evening and Saturday during the day, we provide tours. And they're on an hour and a half. We ask that people schedule them, because we don't have a large facility, so we like to only not go above 20 people at a time.
Well, we put the phone numbers up there, and they
Yeah.
just call ahead, schedule a tour
Exactly.
on a Friday or a Saturday, and
Yes.
Friday evening and Saturday, and
Yes.
tour the facility.
Yes, usually between, I'd say anywhere from 4 to 20 guests at a time. We take them walk them through the process. Friday evenings are really nice because we're doing a lot of, they get to taste the mash on Friday night. And Saturday, the mash doesn't taste good anymore because the yeast has been doing its job over the night, and it doesn't taste. But if you come on Friday night, we'll go up there and tank and pull a little sample, and you get to taste the mash. It's very sweet.
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah.
And you have a tasting room.
Yes.
Now, one of the things that struck me about Napa is that they have tasting rooms. Some of their tastings are $20 a pop. I pass on those tasting rooms.
Right.
I go to the small, well, as you are a small distillery, I go to the small wineries, number one, because you get a chance to meet the people, and it's a much more one-on-one, personal type relationship. And they're also much more generous in terms of charging for their tastings.
Yeah, we do have a small charge. A lot of times that's covered in a Groupon, but we have a $5 tour and tasting charge, so it includes a tour and a tasting. And we have you can taste whatever we have. Whatever, even maybe sometimes we're working on something new. And maybe we'll bring it out, maybe we'll tap the barrel, or we'll let you have a sample of that too.
An opinion?
Exactly.
Opinions help.
That happens a lot. When we're developing we've been doing a holiday aquavit lately, and it's an aged aquavit. And so we're relatively new at it, so we ask people, what do you think when they come in?
The motion picture industry does it,
Yep.
where they have groups. Which ending did you like, etc. So why not
Yeah.
a distillery, and especially where you have gone to such a variety in such a short period of time.
Well, that's how we ended up doing the limoncello. We played around with the limoncello for about 3 years before and let people come in and sample it and taste it. And after enough people just said, hey, when are you going to start bottling this? That's when we started doing it.
And we had a group over, as I told you, I guess last holiday season, and we had a bottle of the limoncello, and they just loved it. I mean, the bottle disappeared very quickly with 6 or 8 people tasting it. It was
well, the limoncello is from Scott Davis. Scott Davis works there, and he is a wine expert, and he specializes in Italian wines. And his trips to Italy brought us our limoncello recipe.
and also has a very nice mural on it, or a painting on it.
The painting is a local artist. She's within probably 4 miles of our building. And the picture is of my wife and 2 of her friends enjoying a bottle of wine.
Keeping it in the family.
Yeah.
The success story grows. Paul Werni, who's the proprietor of 45th Parallel Distillery, it used to be 45th Parallel Vodka, but as you can see, they have branched out in many areas. A pleasure to have you here, and probably as you pull up in a limousine a couple of years from now, we'll talk about where you went and how you got there. Thanks so much for coming in, Paul.
Well, I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.